Hey, what's going on, guys? It's your boy, Nerd Mode On, and today I want to talk with you guys about will Battlefield 1 have a compelling campaign? Now, before we can talk about Battlefield 1, I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about Battlefield 4 and some of the indiscrepancies between the campaign and some of the moments that really hampered the overall performance of what the campaign for Battlefield 4 could have been. So as I'm sure many of you guys are well aware, Battlefield is primarily purchased for the multiplayer component. Now of course that's not to say that everybody that purchased a Battlefield title is strictly interested in the multiplayer component or has internet access. However, with the expandable amount of content that the Battlefield franchise is known to uphold in the multiplayer component, this only grants the player an expandable amount of content that he or she may be able to use at any certain moment. Now couple this with downloadable content, micro DLC, and expansion packs, this does grant the player a lot of content that can easily be available at a later date, and this does overall increase the duration that he or she may play this particular game. Now a constant always across the board when it comes down to expandable content or anything that increases the duration of the game is that a large majority of the time these particular senses of expansion will only pertain to the multiplayer component. Now when we strictly talk only about the Battlefield franchise, even looking at Battlefield 4, there was no additional content that increased the campaign aspect of the game due to the sheer fact that it was not DICE's primary focus when developing the title. So now that we've quickly talked about that aspect of the Battlefield franchise, let's talk a little bit about some of the alterations done to the campaign and where the campaign stands when it comes down to the current iterations of the Battlefield titles. So you may feel like it is safe to assume that a large majority of the consumers are purchasing Battlefield for the multiplayer component, and of course I would agree on that aspect. However, that does not mean that we need to get rid of the campaign by any stretch of the imagination. Just because a large majority of the outspoken community plays the multiplayer component does not mean that the campaign is completely obsolete. Now of course it would be safe to say that a minority is purchasing Battlefield only for the campaign. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are incorrect for doing so. Unfortunately, when you think about internet access in 2016, it's actually pretty low in comparison to where you would think we would actually be at. Even in the United States, there are multiple different areas that A, don't have very good internet access, or B, the options that are available are so far between that they actually don't have the ability to upgrade to anything that would be deemed as acceptable. So purchasing a game and having multiplayer would not necessarily facilitate these players to have a very enjoyable experience if they don't have servers that are going to allow them to play in those particular regions. So in the cases of limited internet access, this would only make sense for players to purchase games strictly based on the single-player campaign. Now the Battlefield franchise has always been in a very tricky situation due to the fact that they sit in between a milsim as well as an arcade shooter. So as a developer trying to make a campaign that's going to be very compelling, this does leave them in an interesting situation, and they have to focus heavily when it comes down to set pieces that are going to surprise or awe the audience. Milsim games are not necessarily known for really surprising or having outcomes that are going to revolutionize the community. However, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have arcade shooters that are really trying to push for surprising the audience by really showing the amount of content that can be available on screen and the amount of explosions and the impact you feel like you're having on the map. So as you can see, Battlefield 4 is sitting in a very interesting position, and they also have to really play that position very well in order to surprise the audience while not going too crazy where the audience is completely taken away from the action that is occurring on screen. So with that all explained, let's talk about Battlefield 4 and why I feel like there were some moments in the Battlefield 4 campaign that really hampered the performance of the campaign. In Battlefield 4, you don't really feel connected to the characters. There's not really a whole lot of characters where you look at and you go, hey, I really want you to survive till the very end of the campaign. The characters in Battlefield 4 feel very expendable. You feel like if a particular character were to die, then of course they would easily be replaced by somebody that just magically popped back into the scenario. And in many cases, a lot of the characters don't necessarily have any character to them. I mean, they try really hard to have a very comedic approach to it, but unfortunately with where Battlefield 4 was standing, they didn't have the ability to be funny while also having the ability to be realistic about the situations that they were finding themselves in. So a lot of the jokes that they were making really weren't very funny. You know, they didn't make you die laughing in your chair while maybe doing a little bit of tear work while you tried to recover from the situation that just occurred. The jokes were more just small little jokes, and of course if you got them you might have went, hey, that was kind of funny, but for the most part you weren't necessarily dying in your chair of laughter. Now alongside that, the events and the scenarios that you find yourself in are completely made up and they hold zero significance when it comes down to the real world. So in Battlefield 4, a lot of the events don't necessarily hold any historical value because there is no official evidence that these particular events occurred. One of the limitations of having a storyline like this is that it tries to take your attention right out of the gate and showcase to you that there has been a significant event that has changed the ideology of the people. But unfortunately, that's just not really how we look at things. Of course, it takes a long time for us to really care about characters and divulge ourselves into the storyline, and we really want to have the ability to change it at any given moment. And when games have this very linear approach to the single-player campaign, you feel like you don't necessarily have the ability to catch up, especially from where the characters are already presented. So in conclusion, for Battlefield 4, I feel like it's just a very poor execution of the story because it's way too predictable when it comes down to the finalization of the overall game. And as a result of this, there is never a particular moment where you look at a character and just know that they're not going to make it. And that's really unfortunate because it takes away the emotional connection between you as a player and the overall characters in the game. Now, of course, there are some games that do very well in this particular aspect, and if you were to look at the Assassin's Creed franchise, they're actually fairly good at doing this emotional connection between you as a player and the characters that are being portrayed in the game. If you look at the original Assassin's Creed games, 1 through 4, of course you're going to have the ability to recognize Lucy and Desmond when it comes down to the primary characters for that particular game. The emotional connection between these two characters was so significant in order for the campaign to move along, especially when it came down to each iteration of the new title. And of course, I'll always remember that particular moment where Desmond and Lucy had this very interesting situation that they found themselves in because Desmond had been carrying this particular artifact that kind of influenced his mind to do an action that ended up killing Lucy. As a result of this clouded judgment, Desmond ends up having to watch Lucy die in his arms, and of course he has no ability to fight the control of the artifact that is taking over his mind at this moment. So ultimately, this action is very powerful, and of course you feel really connected to the characters, and you feel like you're standing by watching this occur, and you have no ability to change what is occurring on screen. Now with that said, if we talk a little bit more about Battlefield 4, there's no moments that really occur during the Battlefield campaign that are similar to this particular situation. So now that we've talked primarily about Battlefield 4, I've given you guys an example of why the Battlefield 4 campaign does not necessarily have the greatest execution of making you feel connected to the characters that are being portrayed. Let's quickly talk about why I don't feel like Battlefield 1 is going to suffer these particular issues that we just talked about. So from a historical perspective, there's already so much information that has already been documented about World War I. For some of you guys that might not be too familiar about World War I, it did start on July 28th of 1914 and went all the way till November 11th, 1918. So World War I did last a little over 4 years, and there's going to be a lot of information that we'll be able to experience as a player, as well as we'll be able to look up when it comes down to our free and available time, especially if we're interested in this particular time period. As a due result of so much information being documented about World War I, you're actually going to be able to experience actual characters that existed during this time period. This is a positive attribute about having a game set in the past because there's so much information and so many people that actually existed during this time period, which ultimately decreases the amount of time that you're going to have to create new characters that have storylines and somehow they find themselves in the situations that they find themselves in. So when it comes down to the cast that's going to end up having to portray these characters, as well as the writers that are going to have to create the single-player campaign, this makes their job so much easier. Now, alongside just being able to experience these characters and see the significance that they had on the battlefield, and of course I'm sure they'll have some ideologies that shine through the woodwork when it comes down to the available speeches that they may or may not end up giving during the campaign, you will also be able to experience actual battles or events that occurred during World War I, which of course does allow the player to feel more like they're connected with the past, especially when it comes down to the historical accuracy. Now, one of the criticisms that I've been noticing when it talks a little bit about Battlefield 1 is that we are using some prototype weapons that were not readily available to everybody on the battlefield. I don't necessarily feel like this is going to hamper the overall performance of the single-player campaign or ultimately the entire title by itself. So of course, being able to have some prototype weapons is going to expand upon the available content that the game is going to uphold. And in many cases, it'll teach people about some of the weapons that will be entered into the war at a later date. So of course, this only does make the game a little bit more interesting and adds a different layer of content that would not otherwise be available. So when it really comes down to it, I'm very interested to see what Battlefield 1 will have when it comes down to their campaign, and I feel like the historical accuracy of the campaign is really going to shine through the woodwork when it comes down to the available content for the game. But anyway guys, that's really all the information I have for you. Of course, I'm interested to see what you guys will say in the comments below. If you guys would take just a few moments to let me know if you're interested for Battlefield 1 in terms of the campaign, please let me know in the comments below. But until the next episode, guys, this has been NMO, and I'm going to be signing out, guys. Peace.